Good afternoon. I'd like to introduce you today to my old neighbourhood, the part of town where I grew up. Most of you from Sydney, so you'll know a little about Cabramatta. In fact, I imagine a lot of you might know more than just a little about Cabramatta. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Cabramatta, along with its adjoining suburbs, forms the heartland for Southeast Asian migrant communities here, from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Laos. For me, Cabramatta is representative of the Australian multicultural experience. It represents how migrants over time are transformed from strangers in our midst to fellow citizens in our community. But it represents as well how we easily lapse into thinking that diversity is just about lifestyle. So here's the challenge I want to lay down to you today. We may all value multiculturalism. I imagine most of us will. It's a TED audience after all. It's hard not to like multiculturalism. But to what extent do we truly value cultural diversity? Are we willing to recognise that diversity isn't just about consumption, but really about a test of citizenship that requires us to reflect upon our values and maybe even to transform our values? These aren't idle questions. As Australians, we're just beginning, once again, to reflect on our place in the world, particularly about how we belong to an Asian century. But I think if we are going to flourish, if we are going to succeed in this century, then it might just depend on whether we've learnt the right lessons from a multicultural experience. But let me take you back to where I began, to Cabramatta. Now, when I was growing up in the early 1990s, Cabramatta was considered a ghetto, a troubled badland, a place of cultural dysfunction. It was a reputation that was well earned. The Cabramatta I know when I was growing up was a pretty sketchy place. It was the drug capital of Australia, the undisputed home of organised Asian crime. I remember drug deals taking place brazenly on street corners. I remember junkies overdosing on bus stop benches. I remember parks and playgrounds being littered with syringes. I remember the footpaths splattered with vomit. Over 2 decades on, Cabramatta is much changed. It's hard to recognise that old Cabramatta. From being a place that even locals would fear treading, it's now become a place that attracts visitors after a taste of an authentic Asia. I went and found you some visual samples here earlier this week. But if you go to Cabramatta on a typical Saturday, like today, you'll find that the restaurants and noodle houses are busy. You'll find that the bakeries, or as they're called, the hot bread shops, are very busy, selling their banh mi or the pork roll. Now, there's an aspect to Cabramatta that's very different from all this, though, that you may not recognise. For me, the real story of Cabramatta is this. Just off John Street, the main bustling main street of Cabramatta, there stands the Freedom Gate. It was erected in the early 1990s. It's built of white marble and teak. On it, you'll see some inscriptions, which are written in what I'll describe as the high classical style of late 20th century Chinglish. The world is for us to share and to respect, to understand illustrious virtue. But jokes aside, there's one inscription that I think sums up the experience of Cabramatta. To be renovative and integrate. Okay, Chinglish jokes aside. To be renovative and integrate. This, for me, is the real story of Cabramatta. It's not about food, it's about integration. And if you were to go to Cabramatta on a typical weekday, catch a train to the city, you'll find the train carriages are filled with young professionals commuting to work or with university students with their heads buried in their textbooks. And the sound that you will hear is a distinctive accent of southwest Sydney, an Australian English laced with the residual tones and cadences of Chinese and Vietnamese. That mission, let me bring it up again, that mission of integration, emblazoned as it is on the Freedom Gate, has, for the most part, been accomplished. Now, this isn't the usual story you get in multiculturalism, even when the story is a positive one. The orthodox tale goes a little something like this. Once upon a time, well, a few decades ago, Australia was a monochrome, monocultural place. Successive waves of mass immigration brought colour to Australian society, enhancing our lifestyles. Now, the story of Australian multiculturalism is obviously a cultural one. A cultural one. We mix and we evolve. That's how national cultures develop. We borrow from other cultures. But here's the thing. If we focus too much on the cultural transformations, I think we can miss a bigger story. Because if you focus only on things like lifestyle and food, you can lapse into thinking that a culture has value, should be respected, only insofar as it enhances your lifestyle. And I think if you lapse into that perspective, then you can actually end up doing more harm than good. Let me give you an example. I'll give you the case of yoga. Now, many in the West practice yoga, but I wonder just how many practitioners of yoga pause to consider whether they may in fact be complicit in a form of moral theft. Now, this is the charge that some Hindus, particularly in the United States, have been levelling. They've been saying that divorcing Hinduism and its divorcing yoga rather from its Hindu roots amounts to a form of cheapening. It cheapens Hindu culture, they say. Whether you'll agree with this depends on how seriously you take your yoga, I think. For the purists, yoga is about achieving moksha, or a form of spiritual liberation. And it has its foundation, its philosophical basis in the Yoga Sutras, which were compiled by Patanjali, pictured here, represented here, in the 2nd century BC. But there are some modern practices of yoga that challenge this spiritual element. And I'm not just referring here to those who take up yoga as a form of exercise. In the United States, for example, there are many Christian and Jewish yogis these days who practice yoga introducing a non-Hindu spiritual component to it. For example, you have Christian yogis who declare that Christ is my guru. In some Kabbalah yoga classes, practitioners chant shalom rather than the usual om. Don't know if you're anything like me, but I sense that there's something just a little off about that. And the reason is that it implies that a culture is valuable only insofar as it can enhance your lifestyle. Only insofar as it can enhance your lifestyle. So why should we value a culture? Now, many of you will say that, well, it's great to value a culture because it's good to be a cosmopolitan. It's great to sample another person's food. It's great to experience another person's tradition. It's great to be able to step into someone else's shoes. It allows us to transcend our traditional identities, whether that's national or religious or social. Now, I think there's a danger in going down this route, because if we're not careful, we can separate cultural value from citizenship. From citizenship. What do I mean by this? Well, very simply, I think we should value and respect another person's culture because they are a fellow citizen of our community. Let me give you an example. Consider the case of a newly arrived immigrant who reaches Australia, bringing with her all of the richness of her native traditions. Now, I think you can say that we should extend the hand of friendship to her, and I think we should. Many will say we should do so because she's a fellow citizen of the world. But I think it's important that we do so in a different way. We should extend the hand of friendship to her, but because she has become, or will become, a fellow citizen of an Australian community. Citizenship, this idea of citizenship. What do I mean by it? It's about ethos. It's about ethos and it's about rights. But it's mainly, in this context, about ethos. In a diverse society, a good citizen is someone who is prepared to learn culturally from others. Cultural learning is very different from cultural consumption. I mean, think about it. I think you can only get so much from sitting down and sharing food from another culture. I'm talking here not about lifestyle, I'm talking here about something more fundamentally ethical. The philosopher Charles Taylor refers to cultural learning as involving a fusion of horizons. The idea being that in order to experience a culture truly, you must be open to learning from its traditions and also transforming the way that you see the world. Not a fusion of cuisines, but a fusion of horizons. I think it's important that we reflect on these questions today, because if cultural learning, if a fusion of horizons is the test of multiculturalism, how truly multicultural are we? I think it's open to say that Australia perhaps has not been as open to this kind of cultural learning as it might think it has been. Think of the Asian century. We've heard a lot about the Asian century recently, but I ask you, to what extent has Australia truly opened itself to learning culturally from Asia? You know, when I hear about the Asian century, and I listen to our political leaders and our economic leaders, the story usually goes a little something like this. Engaging with Asia is about ensuring that we can maximise the returns from our investment in the region. Or it's about maximising the economic rent we can extract from Asia. The language that we use to discuss Asia is very ruthlessly mercantilist. It's mercenary. Can we do better? I ask you. Instead of seeing Asia as just an economic opportunity, should we, for example, stop and pause and ask whether we might learn something culturally from the region as well? Might, for example, looking at the youthful democratic cultures of the region teach us something a little about our own democracy? Might, say, reflecting on Confucian values help us think through the evolving nature of the family or the moral challenges involved in an ageing population? And might thinking about Asian concepts of communal obligation and reciprocity help shed light on that Australian value of mateship? Think about it. What does it say about Australia that we've rarely even paused to pose these questions, even though we say that we're poised to benefit from an Asian century? Perhaps it's because we treat multiculturalism as just merely a matter of lifestyle. Perhaps it's because we regard diversity as something from which we can extract benefit, but not necessarily as a source of cultural learning. I want to conclude this afternoon on this note of cultural learning and citizenship. I think that's the real challenge with multiculturalism. If multiculturalism is about making us into good citizens, then I think in today's Australia, it's about ensuring that we're well equipped to be Australian citizens, but in an Asian century, that we're open to learning from our Asian neighbours. But I bring you back to Cabramatta and that wonderful inscription to be renovative and integrate. To be renovative and integrate, they sum up for me what multiculturalism is all about. It's about renovating, about renewing traditions. It's about integrating into a community. It's just that today we can no longer assume who it is that has to do the cultural learning and what it is that we have to integrate into. Thank you.